Hey everybody. Um, I tried to record our Zoom meeting, but I think this would probably be better. Partially because we didn't go through a ton during our Zoom meeting. I wanted to cover things coming up this week, and I also wanted to highlight some other things in the outline that we may or may not have touched on. So, a couple of things. Logistics first, take a look at the Google Classroom. You'll see the week's assignment. There's two readings for Che, and then you'll also see sort of the Cuba Libre episode 4. We'll talk about those things on Friday, but we'll do it a little bit differently. I'm still trying to figure out how Zoom works best for us. I don't know. Maybe I'll put you in groups or something. I don't know. But so make sure you check the Google Classroom for the assignments. Next week we're taking a look at chapter 2, but we're going to break those up into real small chunks because some of that information is complex. I did say for this particular components on the revolution, leading up to the revolution, and for Che, if you sort of read chapter 1, go back and make sure you really feel comfortable with pages 28 to 33. Hold on. 35. 28 to 35. If you need to do another reading of it, I might just go right through it again. So, I would ask you if you had questions, but I can't answer them. I want to go through the timeline. I'm posting Jordan James and Mary He's timeline on there for everybody to take a look at. If I think sometimes going through a timeline and having a sense of what the material and time sort of chronologically things are happening. We highlighted a couple of things. Certainly, we didn't do a ton of conversation about the timeline just because I'm still getting used to this. But so I wanted to point out a couple of things, and I have my timeline that I'm actually gonna post. And my notes, maybe it'll be helpful too, to going through some of those things. I think sort of certainly taking a look at the relationship between Cuba and the U.S. during World War II. Certainly, if you were to try and make a connection between sort of the Marxist conflict theory interpretation and the role of war and the role of obviously the U.S. continued exploitation of Cuba, with Cuba being allied with the U.S. in World War II, I think that's obviously going to be one key point to hold on to. I think the second point that we talked about a little bit, even just sort of in passing in our conversation today, was the role of the mafia. And although I think sort of the particular piece that I might hold on to is the ability for sort of the government in Cuba to be corrupted by American sort of capitalist greed with casinos, but the sort of the role of politics that sort of folks like Meyer Lansky and Lucky Luciano had in Cuba in particularly, and also sort of the continued influx of the U.S. and sort of the control of the U.S. in Cuba during that time, and that's sort of like what 1940s, and then if I'm thinking about sort of during that time, the other part about this is sort of how Castro is viewing the world, right? So during the 1940s, he's growing up, sort of being sort of a sort of abandoned, sort of rich kid's son. But I do think what he was seeing was this general sort of exploitation by the U.S. and the continual sort of corruption happening in Cuba at the time. This is all going on. He's like 14 during sort of the 1940s, and certainly he's watching all of this go on between sort of the Havana Conference that I sort of referenced to some people when they were doing their outline. I think the other big piece is if we think about sort of Batista and his return by 1952, right? You remember how Batista gains power, right? He's not elected during that time. He becomes more of a dictator than sort of a president, and he suspends any sort of reform that happened again during sort of with the Constitution of 1940. So all of those sort of workers' reform rights, all of those sort of like 8-hour workday, unionization, all of those things were suspended by 1952-ish. And so at that point, I think most people are taking a look at and seeing sort of Batista as sort of a dictatorial ruler, right? Um, and again, even though Castro, I think he's being described in that movie as like a big failure or total loser or something. Um, he is. I mean, he's not being successful in his revolutionary ideals. He becomes a lawyer. He's starting a family. But I also think he's, again, watching the role of Batista and his control over the country. Um, the last thing I think we really talked about, and probably I think the most important piece on your timeline, if you remember anything about this, is by 1953, right? The Makata barracks. And this is Castro's maybe second or third attempt to overthrow the government. Remember, he's unsuccessful, and in 1953, he's not successful again. I think the thing to remember though is that we're gonna mark this 1953 date as sort of a turning point for and sort of the beginning of the Cuban Revolution. I think there's a couple of pieces here. Is that Castro goes to jail, and like really good revolutionary leaders, while he's in jail, he's super bored and he writes his manifesto, right? He lays out sort of his revolutionary laws, is what he's going to call them. And he's going to talk about sort of restoring the Constitution of 1940. He's going to talk about agrarian and land reform. He's going to talk about sort of markets for small farmers and sort of small businesses, and really sort of creating a little bit of a manifesto about why Batista and his potential sort of dictatorial rule is not going to serve sort of the people of Cuba. Um, and it sort of marks sort of the opening of the Cuban Revolution. Um, Sort of the luck of the draw has it is that Che and Castro at this time sort of sorry, Castro's in jail. He's in jail for 2 years. He's in jail. And they sort of have this sort of time stamp on things of like, okay, by 1958, they're going to come back and sort of Castro's going to come back and they'll finish the revolution. Um, I think this is also the time what you're going to see happen is that sort of for Castro and Che will be united in Mexico. They are going to sort of have this really sort of training, sort of guerrilla warfare, military type training together with their militants who are waiting for revolution in Cuba. And so that's going to be a huge turning point. You know, his relationship with Che and Che's influence on this sort of revolution obviously is going to make a real difference in the success of the revolution. Um, I think that's probably like the most contenty kinds of stuff that I want you to hold on to is sort of how Castro goes from this sort of, I don't know, sort of like bougie son and sort of semi successfully failed lawyer and revolutionary, and his direct relationship with Che, who is super charismatic. He was a Marxist revolutionary and sort of had really pushed for sort of a militant overthrow of the government in Cuba by 1959. And it sort of begins with the 1953 failed attempt for revolution at the Makana barracks. I think people probably make a bigger deal of the actual event, sort of like it's if you think about when like Cuban culture, it's super sort of like there's a lot of myths and folklore around it. The reality is that I think it sort of solidifies the opportunity for revolutionaries to actually sort of call for a violent overthrow of the government. There's no more reform. There's no more labor reforms. Castro's ready for a revolution. I want to say two more things, and then you should stop watching this because I wouldn't want to watch this anymore. So a couple of things. Che, we're going to talk about Che on I don't know Friday a little bit, and you're going to read two of his things. You're going to read first off sort of a book review about two authors who have written about Che, and then you're going to read sort of his own writing, which is guerrilla warfare. Che was a huge, prolific writer. He was a doctor from Argentina and wrote about not only sort of we'll watch Motorcycle Diaries next week, which is a little bit out of order, but whatever. Um, And he writes a ton about sort of his Marxist ideals and sort of justification for why sort of revolution, why violent revolution. Um, and so those two pieces you'll read. I sort of mentioned this today in the Zoom. Che's sort of a funny figure. He's not like that anymore, but probably in like the late 90s, early 2000s, Che was like this huge commercial t shirt, like mug, tote bag kind of guy whose face that was the picture that was taken in the 1959 Cuban Revolution of him like looking thoughtfully into the distance, had become really sort of a mythological or like a folklore kind of thing about sort of resistance and revolution. Um, and actually, it has a lot to do with that picture, to be honest with you. I mentioned this today a little bit. It was sort of like the Obama Hope poster that came out by Shepard Fairey in that 2012. Oh my God, 2000 and 2008 election. Oh my God. But anyway, the idea I want you guys to think about is that there's obviously the myth and sort of the myth about sort of who Che was and what he actually believed in, and then there sort of actually was his policy, right? And so we'll take a look at both of those things in those two readings. I posted two questions that go along with it, and make sure you just jot down notes, and you can submit it on Google Classroom for credit. It's not going to be graded. But then what I want to do is parcel out what actually happened, sort of who he was really as a person and as a leader, and sort of the violence that came along with that. So that's what we're reading this week, and that's what we're going to hope to do for our discussion on Friday. If you have any questions, email me, text me, group me. Okay, see you guys.